Well, good afternoon. I'm sorry to actually start this afternoon with a rather sad footnote to the youth questions that we fielded last week. And you may remember that they concluded with a rather upbeat comment from 12-year-old Enzo. I was contacted by Enzo's mum yesterday to advise that unfortunately his gran had succumbed to COVID-19. And so on behalf of all of us, I want to extend our condolences, obviously, to Enzo and, of course, his whole family. But I am grateful to them for agreeing and allowing us to refer to their personal tragedy, because it does help remind me that really at the heart of this public health crisis, there are, of course, individuals and their families who are being touched by the loss of their loved ones taken earlier than would otherwise have been the case. And that message actually is quite timely, because yesterday I also received a number of messages from people who were critical of government's messaging, saying that actually it's patronising and that it's like the nanny state. And Enzo's gran is why I make no apology for that. And Enzo's gran is why we absolutely need to avoid complacency that we've talked about before. And as we start to spend more time out of our own household bubbles, Enzo's gran, of course, is why we need to remind ourselves once again to start washing our hands more. And Enzo's gran is also why we need to continue shopping alone, if possible, rather than with family, and not just popping into the shop for one or two items as we might have done before the virus arrived. But like Enzo last week, I do want to finish on an upbeat moment in relation to that story, and I can actually do that quite easily, because today is actually Enzo's 13th birthday. And so I'd like to take this opportunity again on behalf of us all to wish Enzo a very, very happy birthday. We've spoken before about the understandable frustration for those who have had major public exams cancelled this year, and I want to turn for a moment to those at school who fear that they will be missing out on their major school year end events, be that years 6, 11 and 13 in particular, I guess, because of course the closure of schools may impact on their end of school year experience. And I think it's probably quite easy for us, for any of us actually, to forget or be quite dismissive about how significant these milestones are for the young people who are affected and concerned by that. The good news is that I understand the Committee for Education, Sport and Culture are considering this issue, and I can reassure students that they have not been forgotten, and their schools will do all that they can to ensure that their hard work is recognised in the best way possible, given obviously the very challenging conditions that now prevail. We will be having a debate in the States of Deliberation tomorrow. We hope that we will get the support we need in principle for funding that will be needed in our recovery phase. The current plan is for the recovery strategy to come to the States for debate and approval at the sitting at the end of May. We are also continuing to consider the most appropriate governance, having regard to the system of government, to oversee the implementation of the recovery strategy once it's been approved. The Chief Executive mentioned this at our last press conference, with over 1,100 notifications of business returning to work at Phase 2 at the weekend, it is absolutely inevitable that the roads and the island will of course be busier. And I know that will make some of you nervous. But actually, I think we should all welcome it, actually, as a step back towards a more normal and sustainable way of life, albeit that perhaps we do still need people to continue to drive with care, even if there are a few more cars on the road. And we should also be reassured that the Committee for Health and Social Care would not have approved the revised directions on the back of Dr. Brink's evidence and advice if they were not happy that it was the right thing to do. And I think we should all take great comfort from that. And finally, from me for now, just a huge thank you to all of those who have donated to the Social Investment Fund's appeal, which is now received £123,000, whilst the COVID-19 response appeal has received £50,000. So thank you so much to everybody who's contributed to that. So that's enough from me. And today we're going to run with Heidi next, then Dr. Brink, the Chief Executive, and finally Head of Law Enforcement. So Heidi.
Thanks, Kevin. I'll be relatively brief this time round. Just covering off a couple of points that I mentioned on Friday and just following up where we are since then. First area is in respect of removals. As a result of the change in directions last week and enabling property sales and transactions to take place, we did understand the need for removal firms, clearly. And I did say at that point that we would be issuing guidance for them, and that's something we've done today. So anybody who's interested in that part of it, that's it. The information is on the coronavirus website. And secondly, I did mention about guidance that we would be putting out in relation to recreational activities. Well, we've had a thought about this since then, and we actually think we're going to go further than that and issue our publish our exit strategy, which will cover the phasing back in of businesses, social, cultural and recreational activities. So that will include looking at the methodology we've used, what each phase will look like, how we get to each phase, and then say if we've seen this increased community seeding, or we're seeing the public are just saying, I'm not bothering with what you want us to do, we're going to ignore the advice. If we see that happen, how are we going to go back into those phases? So that's something we're actively doing at the moment, and we hope we'll be able to publish something during next week.
Right. Thank you very much, Heidi. Dr. Brink.
Thank you very much. Just to start off with our update, we remain stable at 247 positive cases on the island, but encouragingly now have 191 recovered and only have 42 active cases on the island now. So really positive as we continue to move forward, flattening and indeed squashing our curve. Our death rate remains at 13, with 2 deaths occurring within the hospital and another 4 presumptive deaths. So that's where we are with regard to our daily statistics. And I think it's important that we keep updating those as our cases get fewer and fewer. The changes aren't great, but what is the big difference you see is the difference in the number of recovered cases versus the number of active cases. So very encouraging from that perspective. There were 2 things that I wanted to discuss today. One was related to queries that I've had from individuals. So I'm sure you're all aware that to diagnose a case of COVID-19 in Guernsey, we do a swab, a nose and throat swab. If that's positive, we then do follow-up swabbing after that. Now, that follow-up swabbing can sometimes have what may seem like quite a confusing pattern. So a person can go negative and then be positive again, and then go negative again. Indeed, they can go negative a couple of times. This is not unique to our jurisdiction. It's been seen in other jurisdictions as well. In fact, the World Health Organization is looking at a cohort of 90-odd such individuals. There are a number of explanations for that. The one is that as a person recovers from the viral infection, the amount of virus dips down just below the levels of detectability and then can pop up just above and then pop down below. So you can get this prolonged convalescence where the virus dips in and out the level of positivity. The other thing that we have actually seen is people have become clearly positive, then become symptomatic again, and they're then positive when they retest them. So there are various patterns that we're looking at. We're doing more testing than most people, so we're actually detecting these cases, and we feel they need to be very, very carefully scrutinized. Now, from our perspective, all of those people are in isolation, so as they go in and out, before we release people from isolation, we try and make absolutely sure they're negative. Some people will have come out and they'll just pop up positive again, and we'll put them back into isolation. These people with low levels of virus, their infectivity is probably quite low. But I think you all know me by now. I like evidence and I like a cautious approach when we look after the overall health of the bailiwick. So most of the people, either myself or one of my colleagues have spoken to individually, but I realise there have been some queries about that. So just to say that's the explanation, that's a biological explanation for that, but we'll continue to watch those. The other thing I wanted to specifically comment on is the cases of severe infections that have been described elsewhere in paediatric patients. Now, there are two syndromes that are being described in paediatric cases around the world, and we haven't had any here, which we're obviously very grateful for, are a so-called Kawasaki-like syndrome. So Kawasaki syndrome is something that occurs usually in children under 5 years of age. There's a possible genetic link, but also an environmental trigger in the form of an infection. And it's been postulated that COVID-19 could indeed be one of those environmental triggers. We don't know. We will have to see with larger scale studies. More will become apparent. But these children can become quite sick. So they can get a high fever, they can get enlarged lymph glands, they can get really quite nasty rashes, red eyes, red tongue, and so on. So it can be quite serious. The other thing that has been putatively linked with COVID-19 is toxic shock syndrome as well. Again, it seems to be extremely rare, but then it's flu-like illness, high fever. I think what I would like to say is, although we haven't seen any of these cases in the bailiwick, is I'd like to reiterate, medical services in the bailiwick of Guernsey are open. And if you have any concerns, parents, if you have any concerns about your children, phone your GP. They might well say, well, the child's got a fever, we'll see the child in the chest and heart clinic. If you're really worried about the child, phone emergency department, tell them the child's history, say they've got a fever, and bring them up to the emergency department. We really, really are very clear that we want all children, and indeed all islanders, to get the appropriate help and care if they need it. So I think that's really important. And I think the final comment I want to say, as we start easing some of our lockdown, is let's work together as a bailiwick. It's really important that we adhere to the guidance and that we don't try and push it further, and that we work together so that we can move forward as a group of islands. And I think that's really important. So it's the usual stay safe message that I'd like to promote very strongly. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you. Chief Executive.
Yeah, morning. We've had now over 1,600 notifications from business and sole traders who feel they qualify to return to work under the new guidance issued last week. This is ongoing and notifications continue to be submitted, but the environmental health team are up to date with few cases outstanding. We would ask that anyone intending to submit a notification form who hasn't done so yet reads the guidance notes on www.gov.gg/coronavirus before submitting, to ensure the process can be as quick as possible for everybody. So far, we have had no reports of non-compliance, and are very pleased to note that Guernsey's business has continued to put safety first and act responsibility with the best interests of the community at heart. Because of the return to operations in some areas of the construction industry, regulatory control on-site has now restarted. Building control have already received calls to book inspections on completed aspects of construction work. Our surveyors have been provided with additional PPE and will be operating under strict guidelines that include social distancing. If you need to book a building inspection, please do so in the normal way. We ask for your patience while we begin to pick up this service once more, particularly with the additional checks that will now need to be carried out. In business support, which is financial claims made for either the grant or payroll co-funding, we have now processed and paid out against more than 1,900 applications. As of today, we have registered over 3,000 firms or individuals for payment, and so far paid out over 6.5 million. Our existing IT system has been improved to help us do so more quickly, but will undergo a major improvement over the next few weeks. A virtual application processing centre will automate and change the manner in which claims are submitted and allow us to process them more efficiently and ease the pressure on an extremely busy service. This system will then be developed for further applications across the public service and will become a system that will become a permanent improvement feature when routine returns to normal operations. We have increased the business support team to now over 40 people on payroll and grants, and will continue to monitor progress closely in this area so we can clear the backlog quickly and get funds to those who need it as soon as possible. Alongside the return to work for some of our gardeners, we also opened our green waste facility. And by 3 p.m. yesterday, on the first day, more than 700 cars had arrived at Chue and more than 200 cars to the temporary site at Long Hoog to drop off their green waste. These numbers are well in excess of those normally seen in one day, so please only visit these sites over the next few days if you absolutely have to do so, or perhaps hold on to your green waste a little longer to assist processing the increased demand and keep those queues to a minimum. The Household Waste and Recycling Centre is also due to reopen on Thursday, but will be for deposit of certain recyclables only. More details will be published online before then, so that everyone is aware of what will be accepted. Please remember that site staff will be unable to assist in unloading vehicles at our sites at the moment, so please bear this in mind before making your journey. With both green and household waste, we are running operations adopting safe systems of work. We are grateful for your patience and understanding, as I'm sure the community will appreciate much of the hard work is carried out on those sites once your waste has been dropped off. All in all, we are pleased with the sensible way in which this early phase 2 has been managed by the community. So thank you again for your ability in Guernsey to work together.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Rory.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon. Bailiwick Law Enforcement continues to function effectively despite the lockdown restrictions. However, we have noticed an increase in calls for service recently with respect to potential breaches. We are responding to such calls and giving advice on a regular basis to the public. On occasions, we will give words of advice. On other occasions, we will issue final written warnings to members of the public as to their conduct. We keep strict records of these interactions, and they will be used if individuals continue to breach the regulations. I have spoken this morning with the Director of Environmental Health, who reports that public engagement is working really well and positively with his department and also with law enforcement with regards to phase 2. There has been some false information circulating about building sites being closed down, and picking up on Mr. Whitfield's point, I would urge the public to listen to the formal sites and the formal aspects of information rather than what circulates on social media, because it is inaccurate. I'd like to apologise to the public for a technical failure we had on Friday morning with regard to the COVID-19 call centre, where we had an electrical fault, and the COVID-19 call centre went out of action from 7 a.m. till 10 a.m. I apologise to people who maybe tried to make contact at that time. However, the service has been restored. Since the inception of the COVID-19 call centre, we've dealt with 8,089 calls, and within the last 7 days, we had just short of 600 calls. Domestic abuse is still an aspect of our work that remains a focus for us, and I can reassure the public that we have sufficient trained and dedicated staff working in that area. If you are a victim of domestic abuse, leaving your home to seek help is a necessary journey. You can either contact the police on 725 111 or a charity such as Safer on 721 999. We are all here to help. We have seen a number of cases of domestic abuse in the past week, and this is related particularly to households who are feeling the strain with the restrictions that we all are complying with. But please, don't hold back from making those calls. I've been asked to comment on surfing. We've had a number of inquiries. Outdoor activities need to be safe, and we also need to at all times adhere to the social distancing requirements. Activities such as surfing, providing you are a regular surfer and you are safe and it's not something you're taking up for the first time, and you maintain social distancing both to and from the coast and while in the water as part of your 2 hours a day exercise, is acceptable. However, it is not an activity where you can congregate with others or friends from outside your household. That would be a clear breach of the regulations. As the Chief Minister commented, the roads have become slightly busier in the past 4 days, and that's to be expected. We have become used to much quieter roads, and it's something we all have to come to terms with as we slowly return through the phases back to normality. Please still take care on the roads and pavements and anticipate the movements of pedestrians and cyclists who are still trying to maintain social distancing while using the highway. In the month of April so far, unfortunately, we've had to deal with 6 drink driving arrests, and 1 was linked to a road traffic collision. We've also dealt with 9 offences of speeding this month, which will be moving towards court in the near future. Those behaviours are in the minority, and I would like to thank the public for the work and engagement that they've had with our staff and the positive support they've given us, and how people have continued to adhere to the guidance and the requirements. Thank you.
Great, excellent, thank you very much. So I'll open it up to questions. Who'd like to begin today? Yes.
I'll go first if you like. I'm Helen Bowditch from the Guernsey Press, and I wanted to ask about the £500 million of borrowing that you're going to be asking permission for tomorrow. So this is probably primarily aimed at you, Deputy St Pierre. And I wondered if you saw this as a really sort of unique opportunity to look at redistributing wealth around the island, because Guernsey can sometimes feel like quite a them and us sort of place. Or is it the case that it's better to sort of funnel support into industries like the finance industry, where you know that they have an excellent track record of really good job creation? Or would you look at things like supporting young entrepreneurs or tech startups, things like that, which could sort of go some way in tackling social inequality in the island? So I wondered if you had any creative ideas like that, and if you do, are you able to share them with us today?
Yeah, great. It's a great question. I think the first observation I'd make in relation to the finance industry is how fortunate we are actually to have it at this particular stage in the crisis, compared to many other jurisdictions around us, because obviously the UK economy is very much a service-based economy now, and obviously is significantly more impacted as a proportion of their overall economy, because they're unable to maintain the delivery of all those services whilst so many people are unable to work. So I think the fact that our major industry has largely, not obviously at full pelt, but has largely been able to reposition itself and using its business continuity plans, being able to continue to be productive from home, I think is a great strength to the island, and actually has helped us in this particular time. In terms of where we go for the recovery, the recovery strategy, as I said, does need to be developed. It does need to come to the States, and the recovery strategy is not about. It's not really about 2020. 2020 is about managing the cash flow impact of falling revenues on the States and the increased demand of the business support we've talked about, and demand on public services and funding those in 2020. Recovery is really beyond, and I think as Deputy Salisbury has said before, we should be looking to think about how there may be some strategic opportunities in coming out of this particular economic crisis, in whether it's repositioning our economy, thinking about the interaction with for example, climate change, the climate change agenda, whether that creates opportunities. So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done, and I think this is certainly in the debate tomorrow. Understandably, there will be appropriate scrutiny and challenge around, well, hold on, what are you going to use the money for before you get the authority to go and raise it? And I think that is a reasonable challenge, and that's why the recovery strategy does need to come to the States for approval. So certainly at this stage, we're not earmarking great chunks of money for particular sectors, whether it's the blue economy or small and medium-sized enterprises or the finance sector and indeed any others. But it's recognising that we will have had a significant loss of economic output. There will have been damage to our economic infrastructure. Some businesses will not recover or not recover in the same way, and how are we going to replace that? And some of that may be around training, it may be around a whole raft of other things. But I don't know, Heidi, do you have other things you want to add to that?
No, just to reiterate what I did say last week, it's our opportunity to think differently, consider the sacred cows that we've had in various areas perhaps, and say, well, what we want. We've really got to think what is important to us as a community now. We've got that opportunity. I know we're going through a massive change here, but we also have to look at, what we can do, and it's going to need a whole island input, I think, to understand what it is that is important to us and what the future holds. And I agree with Gavin. We can't just say, right, we're going to give that amount to finance, that amount to that industry. We've actually got to look at it from the bottom up and say, well, what is it that we want the bailiwick to look like, and from that determine where we put our money.
Great, thanks, Helen. Yeah, Aaron, and then Ewan.
On tomorrow's debate, Deputies Salisbury and St Pierre, Deputies Roffey and Graham want to set up a premium bonds style scheme to work possibly in tandem with your proposals. Do you have any thoughts on that idea, and would you support it?
Yeah, I think it's not really a premium bond type scheme. It's more, which is almost a relying on Ernie to pick your number as to whether you get a win. It is about opening. It's about ensuring that if we are to borrow, that actually there is a slug of that, a tranche of that is available to local residents, local depositors. We recognise that there will be people in the community who will, currently earning very little at the bank, would love to have the opportunity to be able to support their own community rather than placing it in deposits off island or elsewhere. And so that's really what underpins their thinking. Certainly, P&R's initial reaction was we welcome it. We think it's positive. There's greater complication when you're dealing at in making things available at retail level, but quite rightly because of financial regulation.
But how closely are you monitoring travel in and out of the island? We've had reports that some Arini flights recently have had about 35-ish people on it. How successful is the monitoring going at the moment?
Okay, it's probably a question for
any people coming into the bailiwick are still subject to the 14-day mandatory isolation, and they're met by officers from the Guernsey Border Agency when they arrive, together with Public Health, and we feed and share all that information with Public Health, and there are checks during that 14-day isolation period to ensure people are complying, so that's an important aspect. People leaving the bailiwick are also given clear information about the implications of leaving. When they come back, they will be subject to those restrictions, unless, of course, they're in a specific category for a specialist piece of, say, medical work or critical national infrastructure work. So the work at the borders is ongoing, hasn't changed, and I don't know from a public health perspective whether you've picked up anything of any concern.
I mean, from our perspective, I always like to sense check any data that we have, and what I've been looking at is the travel associated cases of COVID-19, and if you look at the information we've published, and it's even more impressive today, the number of travel associated cases have dropped dramatically. So initially when we started, travel associated cases accounted for most of our cases of COVID-19. They're now a very, very small minority. And most of the cases, travel associated cases we've had recently, are people that have returned, have been in self-isolation, have phoned us with symptoms, so have had no contacts. So if you ask me about the efficacy of the border controls, on the basis of the public health data we have, it looks very good.
Just to follow on from that, how are you monitoring private flights in and out of the island who presumably don't go through the more traditional, conventional public routes?
There are very, very few, but we have officers at the airport when the airport is open, and they are all subject to monitoring, and they will receive exactly the same as a commercial flight.
Good, yeah, right.
Last week you explained about how you can't put a ring around the calendar for when phase 3 is going to start, and Dr. Brink explained how you'll be looking at all the data and the evidence and any more cases of community seeding and what's the state of the hospital and things like that. But I just wondered if you could be any clearer at all this week, and because it's known that the disease is a 2-week incubation period. So if someone, for example, or an up to maximum of 2 weeks. So if someone, for example, went to the Chue Green Waste today, touched something wrong and got infected, they might not appear in your data for 2.5 weeks maybe, because that would be when they would test positive or present at the hospital. So realistically, are we looking at June, do you think, until things like shops and takeaways and all those sort of things are going to be allowed to reopen? Or can you be any clearer? Because I think people want to sort of be able to plan and able to get on with their lives a little bit.
Ready?
Yeah, I know, incredibly frustrating. We can't put a circle around a date in the calendar for it, but what we are going to do when we publish the exit strategy is actually explain how we will get to each phase. So it won't be by date, it'll be about where we are, what the conditions are, have we got, where is our community seeding, are people still keeping to the social distancing, hygiene rules, keeping to the stay-at-home message, are they doing this? What are we seeing in the hospital? And it was those factors will determine where we get to that next phase and for a certain period. And that's what we'll be setting out in the exit strategy.
And that'll be end of May, did you say?
No, we'll be publishing it next week.
Okay.
Yep. Ewan, final question.
Just a quick question about local businesses. We know now we're in phase 2, and you said it's really positive that we can see more cars going back and more normality returning, but there'll be some businesses who can't operate under the current rules until phase 4. How much thought is going into the support that they will need? I mean, we know that people like hairdressers or beauty treatment or health workers which offer contact treatments, they're going to be the last to go back, and a lot of them don't have the cash supply sitting there that other businesses would have, so they presumably will need a lot more support.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and it is actually something that the Policy and Resources Committee was discussing this morning at its meeting this morning in relation to enhanced business support, recognising the development of the exit strategy and indeed feeding into the recovery strategy. So we recognise that there will be businesses transitioning from no work through to hopefully back to where they were, but and the time at which they will take to do that will vary depending on the sector, and therefore the business support package needs to be changed to reflect that, and that's something that we were discussing this morning, and further details on that will follow imminently. We weren't in a position to provide details at this press conference today, but that is imminent, recognising precisely the challenge that you've identified.
I think it's also important to say, as part of the strategy, it doesn't mean businesses will go from not being able to work one day to being full normal business the next. There could be phasing in. So even the higher risk businesses, we might be able to phase in some aspects of their work around various things that they can do which are less risky, or if they've got all the right equipment on and the hygiene rules that they can follow, and they can transition to return. But that's what we will be setting out next week.
And equally, we need to recognise that the business support needs to reflect precisely that actually the fact that somebody is able to go back to work last Saturday doesn't mean they're necessarily going to be in a position to earn what they were earning 6 weeks ago, and therefore we're going to need to continue to cushion and support people even when their business or as an individual that they've been able to start back again. So that's very much part of our thinking. Good. All right. Well, thank you very much, and we will see you again at 1 p.m. on Friday. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.